I'm Anthony DiLorenzo outside the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan alongside legal analyst Terri Austin, who's been inside the courtroom pretty much every day with us. And this was for all the marbles today. The closing arguments have now finished. The trial of Sean Diddy Combs is now effectively over. We're going to begin deliberations on Monday. So what do you think of the defense's close?
I thought Mark Agnifilo, who is the lead attorney for the defense, did a good job. I think he was able to share some themes that he had with that jury. He basically said there are two stories here. One is the story of the evidence, and one is the story that the prosecution is giving you. And he went through some of the evidence and he showed some of the text. He didn't have a PowerPoint. I think that
He cherry-picked.
He cherry-picked. And so I think it might have been a little easier to follow had he given the jury an outline of where he was going, because there's so much evidence. There were so many witnesses. We've been here 7 weeks. It always helps when you're pulling everything together to let the jury have a visual.
Is that common for the defense to kind of just wing it and not be as formal as the prosecution?
I would say most defense teams are a little less formal than the prosecution. The prosecution is the one who has the burden of proof. The prosecution is the one who has to say to that jury, look at all this evidence. We've proven all the elements of all of these claims, all of these charges. So it is common for the defense to not be as organized and to not make sure that everything is covered. But I do think that this defense team, in their closing anyway, was a little more relaxed than I might have been. I think I would have been a little more organized, particularly since they didn't have any witnesses. I think they did an excellent job throughout in crossing the witnesses for the prosecution. But I think they should have, as I said, done a PowerPoint, told the jury, look, here's our theme, but here are each of the charges, and here's why there's no RICO. He talked about it. He said there's no RICO, there's no conspiracy, but, you know, we do have those unindicted co-conspirators like KK, like D-Rock, and I think had that been on a screen and he went through it and explained why they aren't co-conspirators.
So Mark Agnifilo seemed to really try and throw a lot of water on the government's case, trying to plant seeds of doubt, poke holes in it, obviously, as they do, essentially saying the case was trash. They had terrible witnesses, the evidence was shoddy, the government did a bad job at investigating this, and the case really wasn't there. This was not John Gotti, this was P. Diddy.
And Anthony, it's okay to do that because they don't have the burden, but he went a little bit too far, and if you recall, the judge pulled him back after Maureen Comey from the prosecution made an objection. One of the things he said was, look, they are targeting Sean Combs. The
government targeted him, and that was a big no-no. Why?
That's a big no-no because there was a motion that this is not selective prosecution, and the judge said you are not going to prevail on this because it's not selective prosecution. That's what the defense was trying to say. The prosecution argued it's not selective prosecution. We have the evidence, and that's why we are bringing these charges. So Mark Agnifilo and the defense team knew that that was an area they shouldn't pursue. He said it once, the jury got a curative instruction. He did it again after the lunch break. So I do think that that was something that he should have avoided. You can say they didn't prove their case. You can say that the evidence was shoddy. You can say that the witnesses were not credible. But one of the things that he went too far on was you can't say that they targeted him. And he said that. He absolutely said that.
So let's take a little bit a look at the evidence, specifically the charges, rather, how he called racketeering. This was an organization of one, not of many, as the government has charged. He said this was not sex trafficking. This was his personal life in his own bedrooms, and that essentially it was homemade pornography.
That's right. You know, he's trying to give the overall impression that the government is going into our personal lives, that they're doing too much. As it relates to the RICO, he said, look, this is something that Sean Combs is doing on his own. Cassie and Jane were his girlfriends. Mia worked for him. These were personal instances with these individuals that had nothing to do with his enterprises. And what Mark Agnifilo was saying is there are legitimate businesses here. You have Bad Boy Records, you have, Sean John, you have his alcohol companies, and that none of the people involved in those enterprises had anything to do with what Sean Combs was doing. So he was trying to make a distinction between Sean Combs, the man, and Sean Combs, the enterpriser who is doing serious business in his enterprises. And as far as the sex trafficking, he's trying to say these were not commercial sex acts, and there was no force, fraud, or coercion. And the evidence shows that there was some force, certainly as it relates to Cassie. It's very hard to get around the Intercontinental incident.
Which he said was Sean trying to go and retrieve his phone, and he took some bad drugs, which made him act like that.
Yes, and I think when you heard Comey get back up on the rebuttal, she basically said that's laughable. So I don't know how I would have honestly handled the Intercontinental incident, because it's hard to explain, and I think he said what he could, that he was going after his phone, that it was domestic violence, that it had nothing to do with sex trafficking, that she wasn't forced. But I think it's hard when you're in the middle of a hotel. We know that Jules was there. He's one of the escorts, and you literally physically see Sean Combs pulling her, knocking her down, kicking her, and that's sort of hard to refute.
Last, with Mark Agnifalo's case, he said that this was not prostitution. These were escorts, and money was exchanged, but what they were doing wasn't illegal, because Cowboys for Angels is a legal company, in Nevada, maybe.
Yeah, I think that was a difficult argument to make, especially when you saw Combs get back up and say that text that he showed with the head of Cowboys for Angels, where he said, Sean Combs said, I'm not paying for that because he didn't finish the job. Clearly, the job was a sexual activity. So I think it's a little bit different. All along, I've said, as between the RICO, the sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution, all along I've said I think that's the easiest one to prove. And the way Comey handled that on her rebuttal, I think she thinks the same thing. They paid for a sex act. They transported these escorts to multiple places, period, end of story.
So Comey, who got back on for the rebuttal, was very forceful in pushing back against all of these theories, saying it was laughable, and that, of course, the defense is going to try and say these things, but in the reality of it is these women were tortured. They were made to be sex slaves, and they could have liked it a few times, but it just has to take one where they didn't.
That's right, and I think in the original closing argument by Christy Slavic, she said the same thing, and Comey reinforced it. And the reinforcement is, look, this is sex trafficking. These women did not want, and she went into details about, they didn't want to have UTIs and have sex. They didn't want to be beaten and bruised and cut and have sex. Clearly, this is force, fraud, and coercion. So I think she is demonstrating, I think both of those closing arguments, both by Slavic and by Comey, demonstrated that sex trafficking involved force, fraud, and coercion. And I think as far as the transportation to engage in prostitution, that's a hands down. There was money exchange, and there were some instances where Sean Combs himself made the payment, not just Jane or Cassie, but Sean himself. It's hard to refute that.
The RICO is really what's probably going to get stuck with a lot of these jurors, and she said, look, this guy can't even get himself a bottle of water or plug in his iPhone himself. Of course, he had these people carrying out all this stuff because he wouldn't take no for an answer for anyone. So after hearing all of this, what do you think we have in terms of a verdict?
I think it will take a couple of days, because the judge is going to charge them Monday morning. It'll probably take a few hours. It's a long charging document. And I think because they'll have lunch, and then after lunch they'll really start with the true deliberation. I think it's going to take at least a day and a half, in my opinion, maybe more.
How do you think the verdict goes?
I think it will probably be a split verdict. It's hard to say, Anthony.
2 out of 5, 3 out of 5?
I think that the RICO is probably going to be the hardest. But they just need 2 predicate acts, and they could easily pick a sex trafficking, and they could pick one other. The bribery is pretty easy to show. They paid that $10,000 to hide that tape. But the other argument is, they did it because they didn't want negative publicity. I think that's a little stretch. But in any event, I think if they get any acquittal it would be on that RICO. I'm not saying they will, but if they do, they will get it there. And I think they'll get the sex trafficking as it relates to Cassie, and I think they'll get the transportation to engage in prostitution for both of them.
And so we were paying close attention to the jurors during all of this, and we noticed at least 2, maybe 3 were really in the defense's pocket, nodding along, smiling, agreeing with everything he was saying. So that's a telltale sign of that there's going to be some holdouts on this jury. We shall see next week as jury starts to deliberate on Monday. Terri, thanks so much as always for being here. That's the latest out here from Lower Manhattan. We'll see you next week for jury deliberations at the Diddy trial.